Hello there and welcome to our program. We're going to be taking a look today at interpersonal communication skills for business. Now this is a very large subject, and in this subject we're going to look together at various aspects of communication. The importance of communication we're going to be having a look at. We are also going to be understanding listening in communication, developing your listening skills, asking questions, and also making sure about feedback in communication and how important that is. We'll also be taking a look at conflict resolution and how you communicate to resolve conflict. So let's start off, first of all, with the importance of communication. Everybody understands that we have to communicate. And indeed, as a manager, as an executive, you certainly have to be able to communicate well with all sorts of people. Not just your staff, your subordinates, but also your peers and your higher-ups and everybody around you, actually, that you come into dealings with in business. So communication is a very, very important quality, a very important ability that you must have. I don't know how you feel about your particular communication skills. What do you think? Are you a good communicator? Are you effective? Do you know the ins and outs of communication? Are you able to understand, for example, why it is that you have failings in communication? You may say to yourself, well, I tell my staff some things, but they just never listen. Is that the case? Maybe it's the way you tell them, the way you're communicating to them, that could be the problem here. Anyway, communication is a very vast subject, and we're going to go through this subject together. Hopefully you will be able to pick up some knowledge as to what kind of communicator you are, what kind of listener you are, and a little bit about your personality type as to how you view the other person you're talking to. But I would like to start off first just talking about the importance of communication in business. Now, you and I both know that if we don't communicate well, there is no business. We can't do business without proper lines of communication. Companies cannot function unless they communicate well internally. And indeed, they won't function unless they can communicate with their outside clients and vendors, etc. as well. So communication is important because it's about how information is sent and about how information is received between people and within firms. That can be within and without, internally and externally of firms. So, with regard to the way information is communicated in firms, a lot of it is governed by how firms are structured. It depends on basically how the structure of the firm runs as to whether communication is effective or it isn't. It's the same, if you look at your family and the communication between you and your mum and dad and your brothers and your sisters and your husband or your wife and your children and your grandparents. How is your family structured to enable clear and effective communication between each member in that family? It really is quite simple. There needs to be flow. There needs to be a certain structure to enable successful communication. So there are certain forms of business structure that we can see, and we're going to just take a look at several of them and discuss how the flow of communication runs within those particular structures. We see that there is a pyramid structure. A pyramid structure is where staff have a role, for example, and there is shared decision making and specialization is possible. In a pyramid structure, this is actually the traditional view of organizations. Information flows up from the bottom, up from formal channels, from staff to management. Management is at the top, staff are at various levels down through to the bottom. And decisions pass down formal channels from managers to the staff. So you have information has been researched and gathered and going up to the management, and then decisions are made, activities are undertaken, etc., and the decisions are passed down channels from the top to the staff. So most businesses, or a lot of businesses, do tend to run this way. Up and down. The channels of communication are up, from staff up to management, and from management down to staff, once they've made decisions. The traditional way of viewing organizations. Next up, we have the entrepreneurial view or structure. And in this entrepreneurial structure, we can see that the decision making is done by the one person in the center. It's very centralized. Here, the entrepreneur or the person in the center is quick to act. Around him, he is surrounded by key workers, key people, key groups or key teams, and there is a great deal of reliance by the decision maker on those key people or key workers to support the decision maker. Here, this example is quite evident in most small businesses who have this structure, where the decision making is centralized, but there are people who can support the decision making process. There is pressure on the decision makers here, but there is also quick action that can be taken because it's very much a shared arrangement. We're not having too much formality with information going up to the top, then decisions being made, and then implementation coming down from the top to the bottom levels. Here, people are key. People are involved in the process, and the communication runs this way as well, centrally to the decision maker. Next we have the matrix structure. This is where staff with specific skills join project teams, and individuals have a certain level of responsibility. Staff can be joining project teams either in marketing or production or finance, for example, and the teams are created and staff work with each other in those teams. Staff have specialist skills, and so the communication process is within the team, and we find that decisions are made from the head of the team down to the project teams, and sometimes decisions are made across as well to different departments that are affected by different decisions that are going on. Next up, we have the independent kind of business structure. This is where organization provides support systems, but that's very much all they support. It's not suited to most businesses because there's very little lack of control. Here, for example, you might have a support system to professionals such as doctors. Then that communication just goes straight out to those doctors, and that's about it. That's all the communication lines involve. So these business structures have very limited application. So we can then sum up just very briefly that regarding business structures, depending on the business structure, that will be the flow of communication. Centralized business structures are ones where managers keep control, and managers perhaps are involved in a lot of the communication process. Decisions are made in the interests of the whole business, of course, and there is strong leadership in these centralized structures. Where you have a decentralized structure, it is more empowering and motivating, we could say. And communication goes to several areas here, freeing up senior managers' time and allowing good development of staff because they're involved. There's no central control. And in a way, staff can get closer to customers this way. So we have centralized and decentralized business structures. And the channels of communication in these structures, whether they're centralized or decentralized, they all flow along paths or channels. As you have seen, some flow more easily than others. Communication between managers and subordinates is usually known as vertical communication, where the information flows up or down the hierarchy, as we could see in the pyramid. This is the traditional form of communication channels. The others that we saw, the entrepreneurial and the matrix and the independent, the channels of communication flow differently and have different impacts. You can also have channels between departments or functions where there is lateral communication, which is across as opposed to up and down. Sometimes that works in the matrix situation of things, the matrix structure. Sometimes it is very difficult to maintain an even flow of communication. So information can pass through these channels in a formal way, or information can pass through an organization in an informal way, as you and I very well know. And communication is not complete until feedback has finally been received. We never really know whether anybody's got the message until we've got proof of it. That's fairly basic. That's pretty much common sense. We can assume that information has been sent, and that people have got the message, but we never really know for sure until feedback has been received. So here we have a diagram of vertical and lateral communication. We have our upwards and our downward vertical arrows, and we also have our lateral arrows across the matrix situation, where communication goes laterally. In each organization, there are communication networks, and these networks are very, very important. The reason being that they are the pathways along which information flows in either groups and teams or individuals and throughout the entire organization. I'd like you to start to think about your particular organization, whether it's a very large and major organization or whether it's a smaller organization. And if you can possibly sit and make a note or draw up an organizational chart, we could say, and plot the different pathways through which information flows. That might be an exercise that you can undertake. So you can see who says what to who and how that gets to somebody else and where it goes from there and what kind of information gets up to the top and where you need to draw information from. Communication networks can be very intricate indeed. They can be very, very confusing, and sometimes the channels or the pathways get blocked. So let's take a closer look at the type of choices we have when we look at communication networks. And communication networks depend on a lot of things. The nature of the group's tasks and the extent to which group members need to communicate with each other to achieve goals. You may need 10 channels, 10 pathways to disseminate information and gather information to achieve your certain task. Some teams may only need 1 or 2, depending on the task involved, depending on the nature of the business. Maybe you just need a direct channel from you to your customer. Or perhaps you need a more intricate pathway to see how the product is delivered to the customer is not satisfied, then the communication comes back to the deliverer, and then that communication comes back to the company that made the product. Here you have a more intricate pathway or channel network. Let's have a look at some communication networks in groups and teams. For example, at the top here we have what we call the wheel network, where at the center point is where the focus is, where decisions emanate from, where the communication comes from and goes back to. There is very little communication between the 4 outside departments or divisions. It's all centralized through the hub. We could say that's why this is the wheel network. It is the centralized way of communication, as we could see before. So here we have one example of a communication network. On the right-hand side, we have the chain network, where everything is purely up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. Never lateral, never back and forth between departments independently. It's through the up and down pathways. Below on the left, we have the circle network, where communication pathways and channels go around in the circle, and that's how information is shared and dispersed and communicated. Not through one central body, but everybody there is involved in the communication pathway. And then on the right-hand side, we can see that this is an all-channel network, where each division or department can communicate in some way with another and give feedback. And so therefore, they can communicate independently or across with each other. There are various networks that exist in companies and organizations, and it's purely dependent on the kinds of business that they have. So start to look at your organization. Where are the communication channels? Is there heavy centralization? Is there a lot of lateral communication? Is there only upward and downward vertical pathways of communication? Or can you go to other departments? Can you go to other areas to communicate? Are your pathways intermingled and going across channels? Is it an all-channel network? We can therefore say that communication flows through formal and informal pathways. Sometimes we might do things a little bit informally, which means we're not using the main pathway of communication. We can also say that vertical communication flows up and down through the corporate hierarchy, meaning that there are several levels or many levels through which information has to flow or communication has to go in order for things to be done, in order for decisions to be made, etc. Horizontal communication, as we have seen, is usually a flow between employees at the same level. Sometimes this can be quite informal, sometimes formal, but horizontal communication certainly does exist in every organization. So informal communication as well can span all levels and departments. It's a kind of grapevine. It's an informal network carrying unofficial information throughout the firm. I'm not saying that it's a gossip line. It shouldn't be, but it is a line whereby some of the less formal information can be dispersed and sent through the organization. This exists in every organization and every company. And so let's just take a little look at that right now. Here you can see in this diagram that we have at the top, of course, the head, the CEO, the boss, and we have very definite lines, the very definite and bold lines indicate the formal pathways that we normally communicate along, and they are summarized in an organizational chart. Normally when you would draw an organizational chart, you use a line which links everybody and shows who should report to whom and who is responsible for whom, etc., and where the levels of authority are. So these are what we call the formal pathways, and this is how companies should operate, and their protocol should follow these formal pathways. If you take a look and you see the dotted lines, these represent the informal pathways along which a great deal of information and communication takes place. And it exists, as I say, in all companies and organizations. This is how companies operate, formally and both informally. If you can picture yourself in this organizational chart, and you can see that many areas have lots of lines coming back and forth and up and down and in and out and interconnecting and showing how communication gets from one point to the other point through various different methods and various different channels. So all the time communication is going on. Communication is taking place either in the formal capacity or the informal capacity. And communication is a good thing. We need communication. If you can imagine those lines being chopped out and blotted out and only the formal communication lines in there, then there would be a lot missing. Companies need to be able to disseminate information informally as well as formally. Today in our organizations, communication has come a long, long way. And the internet, as you are well aware, has been remarkably responsible, incredibly responsible for the way we communicate today, in businesses particularly, but also indeed in our private lives. Many, many, many years ago, I would never have imagined that we would be doing what we are doing right now and communicating knowledge through e-learning. It is a phenomenal thing. Communication has taken the world in great leaps and bounds forward into a modern style of life and business that is going to open up all sorts of opportunities for the world. And as you know yourself, every day when you read things in the newspaper and you surf the internet, there's communication going on every single second of every single minute of every hour of every day. And it's amazing how much information is being channeled through the internet. The global system of computer networks used by many firms is just extraordinary. And we can be in touch with almost anyone, anywhere in the world today in an instant. So in businesses today, communication and the internet in communication has changed the way we do things and changed the way we see things. Suppliers and vendors and the clients that are being serviced can be taken care of in a totally new way today than that they were in the past. The World Wide Web provides multimedia access to the internet. It is quite remarkable. And in your business, whatever business you are involved in, I'm sure if it's telecommunications indeed or IT, then what you are seeing in communication is just the tip of the iceberg as to how we can accelerate that even further. So communication, our companies, our organizations are being transformed into amazing entities, amazing vehicles for being able to reach all corners of the globe and indeed being able to reach all corners of Vietnam. Intranets inside organizations as well. This is a company-wide system of computer networks for information sharing amongst employees inside the firm. Many firms now have intranets, and it keeps the whole organization alive. The corporate culture is improved remarkably due to the intranet that is available. So staff members can get to know each other through their own intranet as opposed to the internet for external customers and external contacts. So the technological advances in communication today are transporting companies and organizations into a totally new world. And you are involved with this. You are involved in being a part of this amazing technology and improving the business, improving the outcomes of your company's business through communication. There is also computer software available that enables members of groups and teams to share information with each other and improve communication as well. There's so much available now that it is mind-blowing. So if you're involved as a manager and an executive in your organization, now is the time. You cannot lay back anymore or sit back anymore and let the internet and technology pass you by. You are a part of it. And this is what I am trying to emphasize to you here in this program as we begin our communications program. The internet is there, computers are here, now we must embrace them, and the technological advances that happen are going to keep happening all the time. So it's up to you to get involved, to be involved, and to not waste any time, to see how you can develop yourself and help communication be outstanding with the use of technology. I'd like to highlight the basic communication model that stands and has stood alone for many, many years. This is how communication works. So let's have a look at it, because it's very important to get this understanding very clearly. The communication is not just a one-way street. There is a lot to the way we communicate. It has become such a science and such an art that we need to really probe it and to understand where we fit in this and how we can improve ourselves in the communication process. Of course, technology is there. That's what I have mentioned to you. However, you are very much a part of the process. Nothing is left up to machinery. There's always the human element, and you are involved in every level of the communication process. So, let's have a look on the left-hand side. A sender, you are the sender, you have a message to send. This is how the process starts. You have a message to send. You may want to send a greeting, you may want to send information, you may want to send anything. So you are the one who is the sender. And you have this message that you are going to send either by saying it or by writing it or by putting it in a report or by singing it or whatever. You are going to encode your message in some way. You are going to put it into a form. It could be language, it could be music, it could be a sample material, it could be an advertisement. It could be your product, which is going to demonstrate the message that you have to say. So you will encode your message in some format or another. And this is the transmission phase. You are going to put it into some shape or format, and then through a certain kind of medium, through a certain kind of method, you will send that message to the receiver. You may wish to send your message via email. You may wish to use a mobile telephone. You may wish to write a letter. You may wish to pick up the ordinary phone. You may wish to send some pictures. There can be many mediums through which you will send your message, which is in a certain format. Now, your receiver at the other end is going to pick up and decode, unravel the message to get the meaning. And when the receiver has got the meaning of your message through deciphering it or analyzing it or opening it up or evaluating it or whatever, the receiver will now become a sender. They've got your message, of course, they've received your message, but the process of communication means that when the receiver has got the message, they're now going to send feedback back to you as to how clear that message was, whether they understood it or not. And this is the key. This is the second part of the two-way process, the two-way street that communication is. So, the receiver, having understood the message, now will send back in a similar process to you feedback. And the feedback will be encoded. It will be put in some format or shape or design and then sent through an appropriate medium. It could be back via the internet if it came through via the internet, for example. And then that will be unraveled and deciphered and decoded by you who was the sender, who now becomes the receiver. So we can see, if you go from left to right, it is a cycle. And along the way, there is noise that happens within that cycle. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So this is the basic communication model. It looks pretty simple, doesn't it? If it's that simple, why do we have problems with communication? If we really mastered the art of communication, we could follow this model very, very simply and never have a problem. However, a lot of things which are described as noise come up in communication. And hopefully in this program, we're going to be able to work together and look at the different elements of the noise factor and to see how we can improve upon the communication process in your particular area or in the way that you deal with your own team, etc. So that's basically it in a nutshell. The communication model. Easy enough to follow, isn't it? So why are we doing this program? Let's take a look at the 3 V's we call of communication. As we know, what you say is important. This is the message. We call it the verbal part of communication. Sometimes that may be written. However, verbal is normally, if we talk about spoken communication, this is what you say. This is the message. Next up, vocal. How you actually say the message. The music of your voice. In spoken communication, this is absolutely paramount to receiving good feedback, to being able to be effective. So first up we have the verbal component, what you say or the message. Next up we have the vocal component, how you say it, the music of your voice. For example, if you're listening to my voice, or you are listening to my voice in this program, you will understand that I have a certain amount of colour in my voice, which means I don't speak in a monotone fashion. I have ups and downs and expression in my voice. If I spoke in a monotone way, then perhaps you might be quite bored by what I'm saying and it wouldn't be very interesting and you'd switch off. What I just did now is speaking in monotones. And speaking in monotones means you have very little music in your voice. Therefore, people are less inclined to listen to you. Next up is the 3rd V, the visual. How you seem, who you are, what people see. When you're communicating, people like to see a bit of animation. They like to see expression. They like to see the visual component. And indeed, we could say the most powerful element of the communication 3 V's is the visual component. We look, we connect visually with what we see much, much more than what we hear when we are communicating. So visual is very, very important as well. It's good if you can give importance to yourself, as well as the knowledge and as well as how you're saying things. Also, bear in mind the visual component of communication. It's very important. And we'll talk on that a little bit later in this program as we go through it. So what are the common problem areas that happen? You tell me, you know. You're a manager, you're an executive, and you've been dealing with people for many, many years perhaps. So what kinds of things go wrong in communication? It could be the fact, when you are actually sending your message right from the beginning, that you lack perhaps gestures, your tone of voice is boring or is arrogant, or you have ambiguous words, words that are unclear. You say things that are unclear so nobody really knows what you're talking about. The sending of your message, the way you send it, could be one of those problem areas. It could be that the environment you're sending your message through has a lot of noise in it, being physical obstacles perhaps, inadequacy of the channels as well. Perhaps instead of emailing something, you should have picked up a telephone and clarified things using your personal touch rather than putting something in writing and having no personal touch. So environment is a very important part too of what goes wrong, the noise around the sending of the message. Receiving also. These are common problem areas. Misinterpretation. The receiver misinterprets behavior or words, or from their feelings about you, perhaps in the past, they misinterpret what has been said. We can say that there are many aspects that lead to problem areas in communication, and we'll explore them a lot more thoroughly in this whole program. By now, I'd like you to start thinking about your own particular communication style. And what sorts of things do you know about yourself that cause problems in communication? For example, let's look at problems in sending, using technical words. Now, quite often, you might find that you're speaking to people using technical words, and people that you are speaking to are actually not technical people. They are people who have expertise in other areas, so all your words are lost. They don't understand what you're saying. So the idea here is that make sure that you are speaking the language of the listener. It could be that you are forgetting the visual and vocal elements and forgetting that they are very, very important, and you're concentrating on the words, and therefore your words get stuck and lost. So use words less. I know you do have to speak and you have to use words, but what I'm saying is don't focus totally on them alone. You do need to focus on the visual aspects and the vocal aspects, your voice, your tone of voice, and how you present yourself, how you look, how you show enthusiasm in your face and your eyes, etc. In the sending of a message, it could be that you are ignoring the situation and the expectations and interests of the listener according to their expertise. You're ignoring them, really. You're not thinking about them. You're not thinking about what they're expecting, what they're wanting. Perhaps you might feel that they are not at the level that you feel is appropriate, so you're ignoring them totally. You're just sending information and not really thinking about them at all. The noises in the environment. As I said before, noises create distortions of the message, and it can prevent the message being understood clearly. It may have been sent in a good way with good intent, but due to the obstacles along the way, it's received and it's not well received. Noises could be disruptions, actual physical phones ringing, honking horns, messy, chaotic surroundings, and when that happens, you can't concentrate. No one can concentrate, and therefore you don't hear clearly, you don't want to listen, and so you don't get the information and you don't communicate, you don't receive the communication well. Noise also can be that there is not enough time, and time may be an obstacle to giving the message clearly. For example, on a Friday afternoon, it would not be proper for a heavy meeting because the time's not right and no one's going to really listen. So noises in the environment. Think about the environment around you. Not just the physical noises, but the setup, the work environment, whether the right people are there, etc. These sorts of things can have a great impact on whether the message is well received or not. So we have different problems in sending. We have the noise in the environment. And we also have the listener. The listener's ability to understand you. Maybe they are not listening attentively. Maybe they are bored, so therefore they've switched off and your message is not going to be heard. It could be that this happens quite frequently, and therefore you need to really gauge or measure your listeners and look at the subject matter that you are trying to send to them and perhaps explore a different way of getting that message there. Sometimes the emotions run wild and the message is lost. People perhaps are afraid or they're anxious or they're angry, and when they're angry, they switch off. They don't want to hear, they don't want to listen, or they may catch part of it. They don't catch what you're saying in entirety. So the emotional state of the listener can have a very strong impact as to whether they receive the message properly or not. Stress also has an incredibly strong consequence for the listener. If there is stress, then quite often someone will not hear maybe the whole thing that you are saying. Financial pressures, you know yourself that these can cause you not to listen. You're worried, you're concerned, and therefore communication is not at its peak. It's not effective because you have pressures. Another very important thing that we do as well, which causes us not to be able to communicate well or even to listen well at the other end, is that we judge. We judge the speaker. We may look at her or may look at him and say, oh, I don't really like him. I don't like the way he looks. I don't like the way he acts. I don't like him as a manager. I just prejudge, and therefore you don't like what he says. You consider what he says as not being worth anything, as not being of value. Now, this is a very big mistake that we make if we prejudge. So, perceiving the message, if you prejudge because of who you see, then you're never really going to be open in communication. And you'll filter out all these things. All of these things are filters. They're filters that drive away the sincerity and the correctness of the message. The other thing about listening too is be sure that you're switched on to listening. There's no point in talking to somebody if they're not really prepared to listen to what you're going to say. If there's some problem there and it's quite obvious that they're not really willing to be part of the process. So these are things that are perception problems, and you will come across them every day when you're dealing with people in business. As you know very well, it's very easy to speak, and you can prepare and write up enormous amounts of paperwork and details and facts and information. But unless your receiver at the other end is open, first of all, and the receiver is on, switched on to listen to you, then it doesn't matter how much information you have, they're not going to hear it. They're not going to absorb it. If you have somebody at the other end who is not in a good state of their emotions, that is going to turn them off as well. If somebody is not attentive, is usually bored and daydreams and their mind wanders quite frequently, then that is a perception problem to what you're saying, and they're not going to receive your message. So there are a lot of factors involved when you are communicating. As we've gone through structures in business, people are the ones that man those business structures. So it's all very well to have an organizational chart written up beautifully. It's all very well to know the different channels that you go through in a structure. But if the people aren't open to listening, then you're going to be up against real obstacles. So the way you send your message is critical. The noise around the sending of that message, also you have to check that out as well, and to make sure that there is no interference that will stop your message being received. And the perception of the receiver, of the listener at the end. You do have to know your listener. You do have to be in tune with your listener and the people to whom you are speaking, to ensure that your communication is effective. Many businesses now are looking at ensuring that their profits keep going up. There have been difficult times, and of course, business needs to be profitable. And there are some important differences in business that we have to look at, as opposed to perhaps just communication in general. So if we look at business, we can say that time is money. The way we communicate, and if we lose a lot of time communicating poorly in business, then that will bring a great cost to the business. So this is why you need to hone your communication skills, and you need to know the pathways and the channels that exist within your organization to communicate effectively. Time is money. So if you can improve upon your skills, you can possibly save your company a lot of cost in terms of that and bring about more positive outcomes more quickly. Time is also limited. You don't have endless amounts of time. Time is at a premium. And the way you use time will impact your projects and work hours and all sorts of things. So in communication, time is also very, very limited. So use your time very well to communicate very well. One more thing to remember about businesses as opposed to friendly communication, business communication and, let's say, private communication. Business people are not family and not friends really. They are associates or they're colleagues. Of course, we have business people who do become our friends, but generally we can say that business people are there for certain objectives. So when you communicate, it's important to make sure that communication is absolutely clear. At home, I know, when you're talking with your wife or your husband or family or just your friends, you can make mistakes with communication sometimes, and we get away with it. We get people who forgive us for our communication mistakes and inabilities. But in business, people don't forgive and forget like that because it costs time and it costs money. So it's important that you understand in communication, or in business indeed, communication must be clear, and you have to notice that and be aware of it. Don't play around with communication in business. Communication is serious business because companies need to profit, companies need to be effective. So we can just sum up by saying that actually business is not a game or a joke, but business is serious. So don't play around with communication. Try to learn to understand the importance of it, the importance of the channels you need to go through, the importance of those pathways, what is going wrong if the communication pathways are centralized or decentralized. Are there ways you can change that or find solutions to problems in that? So we have a half diplomatic environment in business. There are some ways that we can get by with problems, and We can fluff our way through and be diplomatic in our communication, and sometimes we cannot. We have to be serious and we have to be very committed to the way that we communicate. So summing up quite briefly about business communication. Business communication has to be fairly brief. I don't mean brief to the point of short and no information is passed, but generally, if we try to keep things to a concise nature, where the content has all the facts and information that is relevant, that is a good start to communicating effectively in business. Now, that can be either verbally or it can be in written format as well. Generally, these are pretty good guidelines to follow about business communication. Whatever it is that you're communicating also needs to be well designed, well thought out, well structured. Business is serious, so it's up to you then to be serious and get serious about how you design your communications. So look at that and become very professional in the way you design whatever it is that you're communicating, or the way you speak, or the way you write reports, etc. Another point that will get you a long way in business communication is to be precise as well. Precise and to the point. If you ramble on and you disclose a lot of unnecessary and irrelevant matters in a certain subject, then that's not being very businesslike and your communication will fail. Your partner will turn off and perhaps will not be interested, and then you'll have your perception problems. So being precise is a key point in being very effective in business communication. Another matter is being specific. Specific about things. Don't cloud things with unnecessary matters. Being specific and precise are almost the same thing. So make sure that you can be very clear and give very direct information with being precise and specific in whatever you're speaking about or whatever you're writing about and conveying to the receiver. Be clear. Don't muffle things through. Particularly when you're speaking, be very clear about things. If you're writing as well, be clear. Don't clutter things with unnecessary things that make things ambiguous or uncertain. Make sure that all that what you're saying is very easily understood. Be understandable. This is such a simple point, but a lot of the times we are not understood. We are flowering or colouring what we're saying, so it's unclear and we cannot be understood. And be comprehensive. Be quite full with the information that you need to give so that every aspect is understood and everything can be acted upon. Be quite thorough and comprehensive. As you will see, business communication, and we have started our program now in business communication, is a very vast subject. So the idea for you is to now open up your mind to the way that you personally communicate. And we're going to start in a moment to look at your particular style of communication. You will see what kind of sender you are or what kind of receiver you are. And in the next program, you will learn to understand a little bit more about how you can effectively communicate and improve your communication skills. A lot of the programs that we are doing together requires that you get to know who you are. Once you know who you are, you can really understand other people much better. And so we're taking a long, hard look now in the communication process by, first of all, starting with the kinds of structures that exist in companies and organizations, what an organization chart is, and that there are formal and informal pathways in organizations along which to communicate. It's time now that you see that the basic communication model involves the sender, which is you, and the receiver, which is another person. And that communication is not just a one-way street, it's a two-way street. Sending the information through encoding and through certain ways to the receiver, and then getting feedback from that receiver. The cycle goes around to ensure that your message has been sent and it has been understood. This is a valuable, valuable process in communication. And we will go through that in a lot more detail later on in the program. So, once again, welcome to our communications program. We have opened our introduction for you, and soon we will take you through more thorough applications in terms of listening. And soon I will take you through the next step of communication, which involves finding out the type of communicator that you are. I do hope that you have enjoyed this session, and I look forward to seeing you in the next part of our communications skills program. Thank you and goodbye.